Welcome to Novel Ideas, where we chat with local authors. I'm Carolyn Luck, and this is my co-host, Josh Brogadier.
Great to be with you, Carol, as always. Tonight with us, Anna Staniszewski. What a pleasure we have to have you here. You have done quite a bit of writing, especially the last few years. 13 novels, is that correct?
11 novels and 2 picture books.
Oh, sorry. All very impressive. You haven't always been a writer, or have you always been a writer? Tell us a little bit about yourself, Anna, and welcome, of course, to our show.
Oh, thank you. So I think I've always been a writer. I kind of don't remember a time when I didn't love stories. So even before I could write, I would make my parents read to me all the time, especially fairy tales. Those were my favorite. And then I remember when I was about in 2nd grade, we had a tree near the apartment where I lived, and I would climb up there with a notebook and just sit up there and write really terrible poetry and then not show it to anyone. So I feel like even then I was writing, but also a little bit shy, and that's kind of how I've always been, I think.
Mm-hmm. So you were born in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you come to this country?
So I spent the first 5 years of my life in Poland, and then right before I was going to start 1st grade, I had my family moved here for my father's job, and so at that point, Poland was still a communist country, so it was a really big shift for my family, and it was a big shift for me because I was already very quiet and shy, and then to all of a sudden have to learn a new language and be in a completely different place and different culture, it was a huge adjustment. So I think that kind of shaped me a lot as a person and probably as a writer as well.
Mm-hmm.
You said 11 novels, and they are obviously a few different series,
Mm-hmm.
but they're all for tweens. Is that the fairest term to use? What do you like to use? Middle grade, tween? What's the best way to say it?
So I use both. So tween is within the realm of middle grade. So middle grade is usually between sort of ages 8 to 12 is the general consensus, but tween is sort of the upper part of that. And so tween for me is 2 things. One is sort of an age group where it tends to deal with characters who are in middle school, but it also often has some humor to it. It has sort of a lightness to it, which doesn't mean that it can't be about serious topics, but they're dealt with in sort of a funnier way. So that's sort of how I define tween, and that's, I think, my books firmly fit into that, in that they're set in middle school and they're dealing with kind of maybe more serious things but in a funny way, so that's why I use the term tween.
Nice.
Oh, very nice, very nice. So you have 3 different series. How are your series different?
So they're actually, I think what ties them together is that they're all funny, hopefully. So my first series that came out, My Very Unfairy Tale Life, this was like funny fantasy, where she's traveling to a fantasy world, there are magical creatures. And then my second series, The Dirt Diary, is middle school drama at its finest, I would say.
Great.
Realistic fiction. I never thought I would write realism, but this idea I just had, and I knew I had to write it. And then this series, I'm with Cupid series, sort of mixes the two, where it's middle grade drama, but with a little bit of a supernatural twist. And then this book, Once Upon a Cruise, is not part of a series. It's a standalone. And this one I feel like really merged everything because it's realism, funny, middle school girl, but she's on a fairy tale themed cruise ship, dealing with all sorts of drama. So I feel like thematically they all somehow relate.
How have you found that voice so well within your books? I often wonder this. Do people start writing these when they are in middle school and kind of evolve on up? Or are you an adult and you say, I'm going to be writing for tweens?
So for me, I sort of didn't realize that that's what I was writing for a long time. When I finished college, I was writing short stories, I was writing all sorts of things, and I thought I was writing for adults. And then I got a critique from someone. They said, all your characters sound 13. And then I thought about it, and I was like, huh. So, and then I realized the books that had really stuck with me were ones that I had read when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old, and so, which is absolutely the readership of my books. So it made sense that those are the kinds of books that I should be writing too. So once I realized that about my characters, then it was a pretty easy transition to writing for that age group. And so I don't know that I do write in other voices, but I think that voice comes most naturally to me. And when I think about it, I wonder if part of it is because for me anyway, middle school was such an emotional time. I still feel like part of me is still there, where there are certain things that I feel like I can't quite let go of. And so I think I'm just always, it's really easy for me to tap into that emotional place of middle school for better or worse, I guess, maybe more so than other times in my life.
And so would adults pick up on that these are tween books, not just based on the content alone, but also on the writing style? Is there, for example, is the vocabulary not quite as advanced, knowing that maybe a 10-year-old would be reading it as opposed to a 30-year-old, something like that?
I really don't think about that. I just try to write what my characters would sound like based on what their personalities are. I'm not really of the school of thought that you should hold back on vocabulary because kids might not get it. I feel like if you tell a good story and they're engaged and they're excited about what you're saying, then you just write what needs to be there and you don't really worry about it. I mean, that's not necessarily true for really early chapter books where kids are learning words and they need a lot more context for the vocabulary that's in the stories. Those maybe are a little bit more rigid, but I feel like once kids are more comfortable readers, then as long as they're enjoying the story, they'll stick with it even if there are some words that they don't know.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned books that you read. What were your favorite books when you were about that age?
Boy, I loved anything that would take me to a different time or place. So whether that was historical fiction, I mean, I was obsessed with like Anne of Green Gables, but I also loved sci-fi and fantasy, so like Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, A Wrinkle in Time, all those books. I would read some realistic fiction, but I think part of me always wanted to be transported, and so anything that just felt like that kind of had me asking, what if? Those are the kinds of books that I loved. I still do, and those are the kinds of books that I love to write.
To this day, what is your writing process like? What are you doing? And I guess, has that changed since you started writing to where you are now? We often try to get people involved in this because when we talk to a lot of aspiring writers, they often say, well, I really, I want to get this out of my head. I want to get this. I'm curious, as someone who is such an established writer and has had so much success, where did you get from to now, and what's your process as you go?
It has changed, certainly. I used to be one of those writers that would only write when I felt like it, and that doesn't get you very far.
Right.
So at some point I realized that if I want this to be my job, then I have to treat it like a job. And so that's been how I've been able to produce so much work, where I make myself write. I mean, for a while, it was just really getting to the habit of doing it, where I would say, okay, every day I'm writing however many words, or now it's I just set goals for myself, where I say, okay, I'm gonna have this draft done by the end of this month, and then I'll have it revised by 2 months or whatever. So it doesn't always work out perfectly, but that's what I aim for, and that keeps me motivated. And I've also gotten a lot more organized about how I develop projects. So I used to write I would just make it up as I went along, and that was fun, but it meant that I would have so much more revising to do after the fact, because then so this book, my first book, was, I would just write it for fun. I would write a scene here and a scene there, and I would just go and I'd make myself giggle, and then I'd have my husband read it and he'd like it. But by the end of it, I had this big old mess that didn't make any sense. And so it took so much revision. And so I've learned to plan more at the beginning of the process, and to be more aware of if something feels like it's going off the rails, like, don't keep writing and hope I can fix it. Try to fix it and then keep going. And so that's saved me quite a lot of kind of time and heartache, I think, especially as I've had to write more books on deadline, where they say, okay, great, we want the rest of this book, now write it in 2 months, and then I have to write it really, really fast. And so I'm glad that I've been able to figure out that process that works for me. It doesn't work perfectly every time. There are certain books that I can't write that way. There's some that take more time to kind of stew than others, but I feel like that planning phase is really important, and that's not something that I did at the beginning.
Where do you go? What do you do? What's your strategy for the actual process, the craft? Do Do you ever write anything freehand ever? Do you always type things? Do you have a specific, sometimes we hear about a nook someone has in their house or far away from their house,
Right.
as it were, depending on the person. What do you do?
I've had to become much more flexible about where and when I work since I had my daughter, where now I just, any little
She's
snippet
how
of
old?
time, 2.5. So
Okay,
any
so
little
pulling
snippet of
things down.
time, yeah. But now at least she puts them back, so if we ask nicely enough. So yeah, I just sort of, I think, okay, I have an hour, I need to get work done. But I do most of my brainstorming by hand because I just think better that way. And they've done studies that say like your brain works differently when you're writing by hand. It opens up like a more creative part of your brain than when you're typing. So if I'm brainstorming or I'm trying to figure out a problem or I'm trying to figure out more of a character and I can't quite get in their head, I'll take out a piece of paper and just start writing that way. And it's always so much more productive than doing it on the screen. But most of the time I just write on a laptop, and that's kind of sometimes just anywhere that I can. I go to the library a lot to write. And then, if need be, a coffee shop or sometimes if blissfully nobody is home, then I'll work at my dining room table.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. So where do you get the ideas to start your books? I mean, I just love the way the Dirt Diary starts. We'll get into that after break a little more, but where do these ideas come from?
So I've always had way too many ideas, so for me it's choosing which ones to work on. But I feel like my ears are always open for anything that could be a story. So with the Dirt Diary, that came from a story that I heard on the radio. It was they were doing like a piece on NPR about this stage show. It was just people like talking about their most embarrassing teenage moments, and so that was already interesting. And then someone just mentioned in passing that when she was growing up, she was working with her mom cleaning houses, and some of the houses that she had to clean were her classmates' houses. And I just, like a bell went off in my head, and I thought, well, what if you're like in middle school, and so then the embarrassment factor is even higher.
Yeah.
And then what if the kids whose houses you're cleaning, maybe these are kids that hate you, and maybe if you're cleaning their rooms, maybe you'd find out some of their secrets. So I just knew I had to write that story. I had mentioned earlier that I never thought I would write realistic fiction, but once I had that idea in my brain, I just knew I had to write that story because it just felt like it had so many possibilities.
It's such a worlds colliding moment. Yeah. We'll talk about it later. Even the school vice principal's house is now going to be, oh gosh,
Yes.
Everybody's involved. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are here with Anna Staniszewski. We're going to talk about the Dirt Diary, which we already kind of started talking about, and her newest, Dogosaurus Rex. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Novel Ideas. Josh Brogadier and I are here with our special guest, Anna Staniszewski, and we're talking about her books. This part, we're going to talk first about Dogosaurus Rex,
Nice.
Your newest picture book. So would you like to tell us about it?
Sure. So Dogosaurus Rex, illustrated by Kevin Hawkes. It's about a boy who goes to the shelter to adopt a dog, and he doesn't realize that he's actually getting a dinosaur. And so, as you might imagine, some problems arise out of that scenario.
Slight ones.
Yes.
So he doesn't know at all.
No, and in fact, nobody in the book.
What I was wondering about.
Yes, nobody in the story actually realizes it's a dinosaur. They call it his pet.
Mm-hmm.
I was very careful not to use. I tried to avoid the word dog as much as I could through most of the story, because I think that way the reader is a little bit smarter than the people in the story, and those are my favorite kinds of picture books, where you sort of the reader know a little bit more than what the characters know. And so I love reading this at story times because the kids are like, but it's a dinosaur! Why doesn't anyone understand that it's a dinosaur? Which just makes it, to me, even funnier.
It has little shades of Clifford. And
Yes.
And the fact that there's this giant beast involved where you see, because in Clifford you see like the little dogs.
Right.
But then there's this huge dog, as opposed to this where it's like, this is a dog.
Right.
But clearly it is.
Yeah.
At least to them it is.
Yeah,
It's nice.
I actually hadn't reread Clifford in a long time,
Yeah.
and I reread it after this book was already finished. It wasn't published yet, but it was finished, and I was reading it to my daughter, and I was thinking, wow, they must have been in my subconscious because there's so many similarities between it that I didn't even realize. So I'd like to think, it's sort of like my homage to
Oh, yeah.
Clifford.
Yeah. For sure.
So Dogosaurus gets into a lot of trouble in this
Yes.
book
Yes.
because of his size. Would you like to give us an example?
Okay, yes. So, so the dog's name is Sadie, and she does get into a lot of trouble. So here, so you can see her. This is her giant cage in the corner where they take her from, and then so. Ben, the main character, is asking her to do all sorts of tricks. So he says fetch, and she brings back a mail truck. He tells her to sit, and she sits on a car. Roll over, and she rolls over through a fruit stand. So yes, so there's just all sorts of things. At one point, she drinks all the water out of a lake. So needless to say, by later in the story, the people in the town are not her biggest fans.
Question about that. You mentioned Kevin Hawkes as the illustrator. Was he someone that you've worked with before?
No, but I mean, he's somebody that I know because he's huge. I mean, I think probably his most popular book is Library Lion, which has won all sorts of awards. But he's illustrated so many amazing books that when they told me that he was going to be an illustrator, I felt like, oh my goodness. I mean, I already felt with my first picture book that I really lucked out with Illustrator. He just did such an amazing job. And I felt like, is it possible to win the Illustrator lottery twice? I guess it is, because I did. So, yeah.
You mentioned your first book, Power Down, Little Robot. And when I read this book, I thought, where was this when I needed it? Bedtime was always so brutal around my house. And I was going, oh, now this is something that my son could have related to. So I just love that one.
What is Power Down, Little Robot about, so people know?
So that one is about a robot who is trying to stall at bedtime. So he's using a lot of tactics that might be familiar to human parents, but he's doing them in a robot way.
Nice.
So this was actually, this was written before and published before my daughter was born. But I asked a lot of my parent friends, like, what do your kids do to try to get out of going to bed? And so I kind of took those.
You nailed it.
And then I roboticized them, I guess you could say.
Now, has your daughter lived up to the expectations you had there? Or?
So knock on wood, but she's actually a really good sleeper, and
Good.
so I kind of want to keep this book away from her because I don't want to give her any ideas.
Exactly. Do not read your daughter your own writing.
No.
That's great
Yeah.
words to live by.
Yeah.
Question about your books here. So you have 11 novels and 2 picture books, and these came after the novels, or you're kind of interspersing them a little bit?
Yeah, so they're in between. But this book, Dogosaurus Rex, actually, we sold it the same year that my first novel came out, so 2011. But publishing is a funny business, and so this book actually, even though Power Down Little Robot sold after Dogosaurus Rex, this came out later. And that's mostly because it just took them a while to find an illustrator. And then when they did find Kevin Hawkes, he had a couple other projects lined up, so we just had to wait until he was done. I mean, so it was a 6-year long wait for me, which if this was my only book that I had, I think I would just cry every day because, it would just be like, when is it coming? When's it coming? Luckily, that's not what happened. And so when it actually was published last month, I was so happy with the result of it. So if it did sort of like erase all those years of waiting and hoping.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about this book. I love the ending to this. I mean, Dogosaurus turns out to be a real hero, and it's just really precious. And I think, reading this to kids must be so much fun for you as a result. And while we're talking about heroes, why don't we move on to our next book, The Dirt Diary, because Rachel, the main character, starts out wanting to be the big hero and getting her divorced parents back together again. So you want to give us a little bit more about what happens, or
Sure. Yes. So her parents have split up. Her dad has moved to Florida, and so she's a middle school student, and she's really not coping well with that situation. And her mom has just started a cleaning business, and so she thinks, okay, if I can get up enough money, if I can help my mom with her cleaning business and earn enough money to go see my dad in Florida and talk him into coming back, then I can fix everything. Of course, she doesn't count on the fact that some of the houses that she'll be cleaning are the houses of her classmates. And so things, especially one of them is sort of the house of one of her mortal enemies. And so there's a lot of drama ensues, lots of secrets are uncovered in the process. And this is a lot of fun, to write. And for me, I feel like it was just really tapping into the kind of constant state of mortification that I personally was in when I was in middle school, where I felt like everything was just so awful and embarrassing, and so I feel like I really channeled that in this series. So this is the first in a 4-book series.
So you can relate to Rachel more than you can some of the other characters, her friends or her enemies in this case.
Probably.
We're writing a little autobiographical.
Yeah, I mean, the actual plot is nothing that I've ever done. I mean, I try to.
You were never extorted by a would-be boyfriend.
No.
Just wanted to check.
And I try to avoid cleaning at all costs, especially toilets. But but I feel like the emotional stuff is it felt very true to me. I was very, very shy when I was, especially in middle school, and that's something that Rachel has as well. So I took that and really exaggerated it to the point where she has such a rich inner life, but she can't talk to anybody really about what's going on. And then, like I said, this sort of the embarrassment, always feeling you're doing the wrong thing and saying the wrong thing. I mean, I felt like that was a Tuesday for me when in middle school. So I really just tried to crank that up a few notches to make it even more kind of agonizing for this poor girl.
Well, the character I really related to was the mother. And, the way the daughter keeps coming back to her, and Mother, you're always trying to fix things. And I'm sitting there going, uh-oh. You talk about the shoe fits. It was like, whoopsie. And then I would crack up laughing and get further into whatever was going on in that episode. It was very funny.
It's funny with the mom, because again, that's not really anything that's autobiographical at all, except that I think I have that a little bit in me. So it was fun to write the mom, actually, because I think I'm also a little bit of a fixer. So it's fun to really put that into her personality and, again, really ramp it up, and then watch the two of them try to have a relationship, because in some ways they're very close, but because one of them is always trying to fix the other one's problems, but in a way that just doesn't work for the main character, it creates even more drama, which I like having, if you're going to have parents and children's books, which a lot of times it's convenient to get rid of the parents so the kids can have their own adventures and things, but if you're going to have parents, it's nice to make that also in a sense a source of comfort, but also in a sense a source of conflict, and I think then you have both, and that can be really fun to play with that.
You mentioned it's a series of 4. So did you map these out as you went going, or were you writing one novel and they said, hi, we really like this, we want 3 more?
That's sort of what happened. So I wrote the first one as what they call a standalone with series potential, where I thought, I'm sure I can think of other ways to embarrass this girl down the road. And so we sold the first one by itself, and then we sold 2 more. And then it was only supposed to be a trilogy. I call this my 4-book trilogy because it was only supposed to be 3 books. And then my editor was like, would you have, this is after the 3rd book was out, would you have any interest in writing another one? And I thought, well, no, of course not. It's only a trilogy. I've wrapped it up, it's done. And then about 24 hours later, I was like, no, this really could be. It could be more. I realized that I'd sort of left the character at this moment of change in her life where all these things were going to be changing. And actually, that would be very easy to write a 4th book. And it was actually really fun. I felt like it was like coming back to being reunited with old friends, which I know sounds crazy because these are made up people. But
but believable.
Yeah. But it was so fun to go back into that world and go back to these characters that after so many books I knew so well. So I think that actually might have been the most enjoyable book that I've written, just because I just could jump into it and be like, what have these big guys been up to? So it was fun.
Well, a strange other coincidence in that book is I happen to have a cousin who is a teacher, and she always spends her lunch period with her kids, and her name is Mrs. Kennedy.
Oh.
And that's the same name as the teacher in the book. I'm going, wait a minute, where did she get this from?
Yeah, a lot of the teacher names in my books are from teachers who I really had, had in real life. I think there's a Mrs. Brown in almost all of my books, because I had a Mrs. Brown, I think, in 3rd grade, and I'm just very lazy when it comes to teacher names, apparently. So I just like to pepper the same ones in. Then people, readers can just imagine these all take place in the same universe or something.
Would you read a short passage?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
So this is, for the first chapter, Rachel, the main character, and her mom have gone to their first house that they're supposed to be cleaning. And it turns out that not only is this the house of Rachel's worst enemy, but also her very, very cute brother is there. And she's just completely embarrassed herself in front of him. Rachel, come on, Mom calls already down the hall. I realize I'm still standing in the foyer, staring at Evan with my mouth open and practically drooling on myself. He looks back at me with an uncertain smile. I can't help noticing that his eyes are the same shade of green as his Celtics jersey. Are you okay? He asks. I try to nod and move forward at the same time. That just makes me lose my balance. I stumble forward and crash. The mop and broom fly out of my hands and land on the floor, followed by several bouncing rolls of paper towels. Booger crap, I cry, stooping to gather everything up. Wait, did I just say that out loud? Here, let me help, says Evan. As he kneels beside me, I catch the sense of peppermint and laundry detergent. Did you just say booger crap, he adds? I nod, mortified. Why do Dad's goofy swears always have to pop out of my mouth at the worst times? But Evan laughs as he gets to his feet, his arms full of paper towels. That's funny. Think I might have to use that sometime. I try to say okay, but for some reason it comes out in slow motion. Okay. This is even worse than the one time I tried to talk to Steve Mueller. Evan just laughs at it again in a way that makes me think he isn't laughing at me. He grabs one of the rolls of paper towels and balances it on top of his head as he walks alongside me. I can't help smiling. When we get to the Riley's kitchen, I almost drop everything all over again. Every surface gleams like it's covered in non-stick cooking spray. If we had this kind of kitchen at home, I'd be able to bake all the time without Mom complaining that I'm taking up too much space. I mean, they actually have 3 ovens. Thank you, Evan, says Mom, rushing to take the cleaning supplies from him. We don't want to be in your way, so just pretend we're not here. He shrugs. I'll be in my room if you need anything. Don't worry about cleaning in there today. Then he glances at me and flashes a crooked grin. See you later, booger crap. Great. Perfect. Just the kind of nickname you want a guy calling you. 10 minutes on the job, and I've already made a total fool out of myself. At this rate, I won't even survive until lunch.
That's awesome. It really gives us a flavor.
They really move, too. Yeah, you can fly right through. That's neat. I love it. That's great.
Wow. Well, I think we're about out of time talking about flying right through it. So it's time for us to power down. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us this evening. It's just been wonderful having you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
An absolute pleasure. Carol, thank you very much.
Your books, we can go to your website, which is annastan.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone here at the studio, and to all our viewers. Come join us next time.